So let's go. That's the recording progress. Okay, welcome everyone. Firstly, hope everyone had a good week in the build-up, please God, to Purim. Again, we hope only good news nationally, only good news, of course, to everyone in Israel. Please God, hostages returning, and only good things. Okay, last week, what did we talk about? I'm going to answer that. It's always dangerous to ask everyone last week what we talked about. Okay. So last week, what we did is we laid the groundwork for the central question, which is what is Jewish philosophy? What's it aiming to do? What are the goals? What are the targets? What are the objectives? And effectively, we danced around 3 points, but there were three central points. Number one is we act in life based on our constructs. In other words, how we see life, how we act in life, whether it's parenting, whether it's right and wrong, moral objectivity, do you remember subjective, objective, tastes and rights and wrong, all of that moral clarity depends on your constructs. Any given conflict in the world, when you decide who is the victim and who's the perpetrator, that will depend on your constructs, your sense of right and wrong. Okay, number one. And it's not on an esoteric global level, it's on a practical level as well. Kids bickering and fighting, or competition opening up. Let's say you've got a shop and there's someone opening up a shop next door. The fish and chip shop that we heard about. There's another fish and chip shop opening up next door. Is that right or wrong? Is that opening up the market to everyone, or is that unfair, encroaching on competition? That will all depend on your constructs. Okay. So we said Jewish philosophy effectively is the distilling or clarification of those constructs. In other words, working out how and what we know to be true from a Jewish lens or through a Jewish perspective. Okay, I will add that there are two elements in terms of how we get to Jewish philosophy. I'm actually going to do a lot of this today. Number one is passed down wisdom. In other words, effectively wisdom that's handed all the way down effectively from Mount Sinai, although we're not there yet. And number two is a fair amount of discussion and clarification, both textually and between various commentaries along the years or through the years. Okay, so that's a classic Jewish thing. Handed down wisdom and using our own brains to work that out. That's what we did last week. Then we talked about the centrality of emunah, in other words, belief or faith, as we will discuss this week. In other words, how emunah, belief in God, trust in God, faith in God, knowledge of God, we'll do all of that, very much is a central fulcrum in how a lot of these issues play out. Okay, so today I said we would meet two friends. I think last week they were portrayed as like a pen and a cup or something silly like that. Unfortunately, the cup has since seen the bin. I apologize for that. So we don't have the cup anymore, but we still have our two friends. We've got Yaakov and Jake. Okay, we're going to call them Yaakov and Jake. And they're very two crucial characters because they are going to be the vehicles through which we're going to play out two very central pieces in how we define faith. Okay, so it goes like this. I was actually having a discussion with one of my students in school today. He was saying, yeah, faith, belief in God, belief in Torah, it's all kind of, it's like divorced from reality, it's divorced from logic, it's kind of blind faith, and you can't prove it, and you can't any of that. So that's what we're going to look at today. In short, the short version of this question is, does belief exist in the head or the heart? You can do it like that, and which we're going to clarify this week and properly clarify and deepen next week. The long version is, if you have your Yaakov and Jake juxtaposed side by side, Jake is a person who grew up with no Jewish knowledge whatsoever, no Jewish background, and came to it for themselves. They worked it out, they asked the questions, they did the research, they came to faith, belief in God, trust in God, he came all by himself. That's Jake and his life. And then next to him, let's make it more sweet, next to him in Shul, yeah, we said last week Shul is a positive place. I repeat, Shul is a positive place. Yeah, next to him in Shul, we have Yaakov. Yaakov grew up in a very, very sheltered environment. Let's label that. Let's call it the back alleys of Mea Sharim, which is a very ultra Orthodox neighborhood in Jerusalem. And Yaakov never questioned his faith. He never had any reason to question his faith. And he grew up very religious and continued to be very religious. Right? Never had any research questions, etc. No reason to. Right? Who's, in terms of faith, forget any other elements of their lives for a second. In terms of pure faith, who is leading the optimum life? Do we expect people to be like Jake? In other words, questioning, researching, working it out? Or does Judaism expect, it doesn't matter, however you get there, you get there? Yaakov is also a good model. Everyone clear with that question? I just, without answers, but I just want to make sure the question landed. Yeah. But by the way, most of us will meet. Thank you, thumbs up and facial expressions. Most of us at some point in time will bump into various iterations of your Jakes and your Jacobs. Yeah. I joke that most people tend to, not all, but tend to have a relative that is more religious than them and a relative that's less religious than them. Right? Of course, we are normal. Understand? Yeah, we're normal. They're more religious. They're less religious. So we've all got our Yakovs and Jakes, so to speak, in our world. And sometimes Yaakov and Jake will clash. Sometimes they will. I don't mean they hate each other, but I mean their worldviews and etc. and how they see things will clash. Let's see if we can work that out. So I'm now going to go deeper into the life of Yaakov and the life of Jake, if you don't mind. Yeah, we need a jingle for this. I'm sorry, we don't have it. Yeah, deeper into the life of Jake like Yaakov, and it goes like this. The great advantage of a life of Jake, is that it's on solid ground. He's worked it out for himself. He's, so to speak, the Avraham Avinu of his day, without making it too dramatic. Right? He's worked it out. He's come from nothing. He's smashed the idols, whether physically or metaphorically. He's done all the working, he's done all the research, and he's got that solid ground, not unshakable. Okay. The disadvantage of Jake is, so we'll put it like this: if we are expected to question our faith, in other words, you go to Yaakov and say, Yankel, have you ever thought about questioning? Yeah, kind of thing. If we're expected to question our faith, what about someone who questions and comes up with quote unquote the wrong answer? In other words, someone who engaged in legitimate study and legitimate research, and he's interested and he's not grinding any axes and trying to find the answer that he or she wants. And they decide, based on research, that actually God doesn't exist and there's no Torah and finished. Right? If we are supposed to go on a journey of faith and working it out, then can you blame someone if they come up with the wrong answer? No. Yeah, that's issue. That's the Jake issue, right? Mm-hmm. The issue with Yaakov is the exact reverse issue. His faith may be very solid, right? He's not got a reason to question. But are we not supposed to put in any effort in that regard? Well, where's there room for growth? Or if you want to put it its most acutely, or its most exaggerated, I would say, a bit hyperbole here, which is, when it comes to Yaakov, is it just illogical? In other words, is faith really illogical? In which case, then why does he get any points for believing this versus someone who believes any crazy thing in the world? There are plenty of people who believe crazy things because they've been told so by their parents or by others, and there are plenty of cults whose belief is based on no logic or rational thinking whatsoever. Right? So has Yaakov just happens to have struck gold? You know what I mean? Right? So how does that work? So we've got issues both ways. Everyone good with me? Yeah. If you're a Jake person,
Yaakov has got.
Gideon?
Surely Yaakov has got I don't know if you want to call it a disadvantage, but if his faith is sort of he breathed it in and hasn't had to discover it for himself, then you said points. Does he get points? I would have thought maybe he doesn't. If that's his starting point, unless he somehow challenges himself and grows, then he's not getting points. He's just treading water.
Right, he's just doing it. He's doing it right. Okay, good. So we're going to see that. We're going to see that, please God, as well. Okay, this is the topic. As you can see, it's a big topic. I'd like to do this. I'd like to go back to a little bit of basics and to work out what emunah is, what faith is, and we're going to take it a little bit forward. Okay, so I'm going to share the screen at some point. I'm going to hold back for a moment, but I'm going to quote you a few sources here. They're quite important sources. We'll see how we go. Actually, you know what? Let me see if I can share the screen. Big risk coming up. No, it's actually not letting me for the moment, but that's okay. Fine, we'll live without it. Okay, I'm going to read you a couple of sources in Hebrew and English, and we're going to see where we get to. So the first is there is a Rambam. The moment we're just going to deal with the centrality of emunah in terms of what mindset it's supposed to create. And then I'm going to come back to Yaakov and Jake. So first is like this. The Rambam says in the laws, it's called Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah. He says like this. He says, the foundation of all foundations and the pillar of all wisdoms is to know, the word know here is very important, there's a first cause, Leida she'esham matzoi rishon, to know there is a first cause, and it creates everything. Okay, so there's two operative parts to that Rambam. A, he says faith is the foundation of all wisdoms. Interesting billing. Yeah. And number two, he used the word to know. Right? To know. Now, to know can mean two different things, right? It can be almost quantitative. We'll call it that. In other words, knowing means not necessarily where it came from, but it's a level of faith, right? Or knowing means to work it out for yourself, right? So we're going to come back to that in a second as well. Okay. The Bahag, who's one of the early commentaries as well, there's that 900 years ago, and we're going to return to this a bit next week. He says like this. He says, we have a tradition that we have 613 mitzvot. So he says, don't belittle emunah, faith, by counting it as one of the 613. It's a prerequisite to one of the 613. Right? Why? Because it's the basis, it's the foundation for everything. He calls it, in his words translated to English, it's the foundation of faith, and therefore it's not included in the list of mitzvot. It's foundational, right? It precedes, it comes before, etc. Jonathan, you had a question?
I do. Sorry to cut you in the flow, but
Right.
wanted to ask you something. So when I first heard of the term emunah, the English definition I was presented with was faith. But since then, I've heard that faith is not really the right way to define emunah, to translate emunah. And I feel like, unless you say no, it is, then that's fine. But I just felt like perhaps it'd be for me useful if you could spare some time, not now, but to really, I think, define and translate emunah really properly, so that as we move forward through this, that we truly get a good grasp of what emunah really means.
Yeah, 100%.
And I don't know if be clarified. Yeah.
100%. Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. That's exactly what we're going to do actually today and next week. That's exactly the topic. Yeah, 100%. In other words, the other way of saying that is look at it definitionally. If you looked up the word emunah in the dictionary, what would come up? Is it knowledge? Is it faith? Is it faithfulness? Is it, where is that on that barrier? That depends on this. That completely depends on this, right? In other words, the Jake model is that emunah means questioning, right? It means knowing. The Yaakov model is that emunah means what we would call faith. Okay, 100%. You're right. Maybe I should just use the Hebrew word emunah, and then we can all agree that it's not clear currently. Hopefully in the next 10, 15 minutes it will be. But yeah, 100%. Good call, Jonathan. Well done. Okay, good. Thank you for also raising your hand. Very polite on this Zoom call. Okay, so those are the first two elements of emunah. Again, prerequisite and an element of knowledge. Okay. The one other thing which I think is beautiful, it belongs a little bit to last week, but I wanted to share it with you. There was a rabbi called the Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish was relatively recent in Jewish history. When we say recent, we mean like 100 years. That's recent in Jewish history. So he died in 1953, and he says the following, an amazing thing. He says, when a person comes to the realization that Hashem's existence is truth, he says, a boundless joy and connection to the soul enters, a feeling unmatched by anything this world can offer. In other words, regardless of whether emunah starts off with an intellectual realization or a journey, or just doesn't, Yaakov, there's a certain, I'd say there's a certain impact or imprint that an emunah mindset has on a person, which is not just limited to the brain. Okay, it's not just cognitive. Even if you got there in a cognitive sense, it's not just cognitive. Okay, let's see if we can, Jonathan, start defining what emunah is. Okay, we good for this? It's a bit of a strapping your seatbelts moment. We're going to continue. We're going to start this week and continue next week. Okay, firstly, technical point. What is included in the mitzvah of emunah? What is included? Right? In other words, if you look up in the Torah definition, dictionary of emunah, what is included? Okay, so we've done part of it. Number one is that God is all-powerful and eternal. That was the Rambam. The Ramban also says the same commentary. Others add it's not only believing in God, it's actually believing in the Jewish narrative. And it's that God took us out of Egypt, that God will redeem us again in the future. Some add that as well. Okay, but all of that is very nice, but it still doesn't help how we get there. Is it the Jake model or is it the Yaakov model of getting there? As you can debate about whether emunah is just belief in God or belief in what he did for us and what he will do in the future as well, future redemption, which is, by the way, the journey we go on Seder night, on Pesach. So we start with talking about God and then what he did for us and then redemption, future. But how do we get there? Okay, so in order to do this, I have to introduce you to a Hebrew word. I know you're never going to believe this is a thing. It's called machlokas, right? In other words, argument. Yeah, I know. Jews arguing. You'd have thought it would never happen. But this is not a bickering type of argument. This is argument meaning different sides or different approaches. Right? I'm going to display them as a little bit polarized, and then hopefully we'll bring them back together. Okay. The truth is, the Yaakov and Jake models have been probably a debate for hundreds of years. Okay, and I'd like to just work out each one. In other words, over the course of 900 years plus, there were different commentaries that advocated which model is best, effectively. In other words, there were commentaries that said, look, faith, emunah, even if, and I'm going to repeat this very soon later with added definition, even if emunah, faith, has logical basis, again, has a logical basis, but it doesn't matter how you arrive at it. You don't need to arrive at it logically. However you arrive at it is good enough, right? Again, they're not denying it being logical. I'm going to deal with some of the logic next week. They're not denying it being logical. They're saying that you don't
What
have...
I found is that these
Pardon,
things
Gideon?
here.
Say again, Gideon?
Sorry, I didn't realize I'm off mute because I moved from the car. Sorry, I'm going on mute.
All right. Good. Okay. I thought it was going to be something much more incriminating. Oh well. Shame. What's it called again? Again, the Yaakov proponents say like this. It's not that emunah, faith, belief, doesn't have logic to it. It does. But you don't need to come to it through logic. In other words, there's no need to question per se. You can if you want. There's no need to research per se. You can if you want. If you did research and if you did invest in logic, you would get to there anyway, right? But the main part of emunah isn't the journey, it's the end goal, right? It's the end goal. Again, we want to say it very, very carefully. As distinct from some other faiths, there is an understanding that faith is logical, faith is rational. You can get there through questioning. The Yaakov proponents just say you don't need to get there through questioning. In other words, you could live a Yaakov type life in wherever, a almost fortified or society where they don't question, right? And that would be fine. It's about the end goal, not the journey. In other words, however you get to faith, totally fine. But again, I want to stress, they don't say that faith is illogical or irrational. The issue with saying faith is illogical, irrational, is that then there is no reason, so to speak, to believe this more than anything else, right? Then the crazier your belief system, the more reward you would get, so to speak. In other words, you'd have no rebuttal to anyone. You'd never be, if you say that emunah is illogical, then there's no reason anyone should grow through emunah. There's no reason you should be able to convince anyone of emunah, and there's no reason to dissuade anyone from any faith, basically, because if you hold that any form of religion is never based on logic, then why should you believe this more than that? Right? So again, the Yaakov proponents, very important, proponents, do not say that emunah, faith in God, is illogical. On the contrary, it is logical, it has rational basis, all of that. Just we don't care how you get to emunah. It's about having emunah. Everyone good with that? Okay, that's the Yaakov fan club, right? And those, by the way, just to name drop, I'm telling you the Yaakov's over history. The Rashba, who lived about 900 years ago, you'll notice there's a lot of living about 900 years ago. Yeah, there's a lot of that living about 900 years ago. So the Rashba makes this point a couple of times. The Malbim, who lived about 100 or so years ago, 100, nearly 200 years ago, sorry, he says something very interesting. He says that Abraham's journey in the 10 tests brought him from someone who was acting through his logic and working out God existed to something above and beyond, which is a much higher level of faith, he says. In other words, logic will take you so far, but each test that Abraham faced was saying, okay, your logic takes you here, but your logic also has limits. And to an extent, there's a risk that if the only way you got there is through logic, you're serving your concept of God as opposed to God himself. If I can ground that, when God tells Abraham, I know we're going a bit quickly, but when God tells Abraham, go and sacrifice your child, yeah, and Abraham says, hold on a second, I didn't think this is part of the deal. The Malbim says what that was Hashem saying, I know you didn't think it was part of the deal, right? But the risk is if you only serve things that are part of the deal, which you yourself came to, the risk is you're only serving your concept of what God should be like instead of serving God. And that risk is that you're serving your own constructs and notions. Right?
But is that true? Surely once you've logically determined that God is the first cause and is doing it not for a laugh, but for your own good, then whatever doesn't make sense to you, it must mean that you're thinking illogically because you've already logically established God. I don't see why that wouldn't follow.
But so, okay, good. So we'll get to this actually, not this week, but I'm happy to do this already. Even if you get to God logically, he's still God. In other words, there's certain things you can't understand about him. So, otherwise you wouldn't need any guidance whatsoever from him. You just say, God would come down on Mount Sinai and say, people, use your own logic and do it well. Right? In other words, there's always going to be some form of leap. We're going to talk about that emunah soon. That's basically them. Okay, now those are the Yaakov people. What about the Jake proponents? Right, so the Jake proponents, fascinatingly, the Rambam is among them, as are others. Again, I could share the sources with you, but I think just for the basis of, or for the purposes of making this fit into half an hour, to be honest, we're not going to go through all the sources. But let me quote one, the Sefer HaChinuch, written anonymously, guess what? Around 900 years ago, says the following. He says, a person who merits to ascend levels of wisdom, they will come to see emunah as an absolute truth and the alternative as impossible. Then they will have fulfilled the mitzvah in the best possible way. There's a sense of journeying, of questioning, of working out. The way the Ramchal, Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, who lived around 500 years ago in Italy, he says that everyone needs to believe and know there's a first cause. In other words, there's a sense of knowledge which is understood to be a sense of working out, going on that journey, actually spending time researching and questioning and plumbing those depths to increase and deepen your faith. Okay, deepen your emunah, sorry, Jonathan, deepening your emunah. Okay, so what started with two different models and they're arguing with each other, Yaakov and Jake, are actually two very different and legitimate approaches going back hundreds of years. Yaakov approach is it's not about the journey, it's about the destination. Not that it's illogical, but you don't always need to go to attack it through logic. Again, questioning is fine, you just don't need to, right? And then you've got the Jake model, which is, no, you have to question, you have to work it out, etc. I would add that in our society, where we are exposed to many different belief systems, right? We're not living in the sheltered back streets of Me'asharim. How do I know? Because we're on a Zoom call, yeah? Whatever, so it does behoove us to have some form of rational basis and some form of working out, how do I know I'm correct? We'll do some of that next week. But given that we are exposed to the wider society and lots of multicultural beliefs, etc., so the Jake approach is probably resonating more with people than just the pure Yaakov approach. Right? Certainly, in a parenting sense, to bring up a child, assuming they're like a dear Yaakov and not giving them any tools, right, when they're going to be mixing with a variety of people with different belief systems, I think a parent certainly has to give them some Jake tools. Okay, but we've left one stone unturned when it comes to Jake. Right, what is that stone unturned? Whams if young Jakeler is researching, yeah, but he ends up getting all the wrong answers. Right? Like, how does that work? Yeah, how does that work? Actually reminds me, it's interesting. I had a group of missionaries who came knocking on my door a few months ago. Yeah, and probably not the right house to knock on, to be honest. I must admit. So I started having a very polite conversation with them, and then my wife and children got very upset. We're actually in the middle of Shabbos lunch. My wife and children got a bit upset, so I kind of closed the door and continued outside with them. And it was a fascinating conversation because they first said, "Can you read this? Right? Can you read it out?" And it became very apparent it was a translation of something from Tehillim. Right? So I said, "Very happy to. Would you like the original source?" They weren't very happy at that point. Yeah. So I didn't get out the Hebrew. And then I asked various questions, and it became apparent that kind of the more I rationally questioned their beliefs, and again, I'm talking about this group of people, ignore the generalization unintended, the more I questioned their beliefs, kind of more they almost retreated into their shell of, oh, it doesn't matter if it's rational anyway. Right? And there was this, I realized I was just, no pun intended, like cut from a different cloth. In other words, just chasms apart. And my notion was closer to the Jake, where it has to be logical, it has to be worked out, it has to be rational, and theirs was clearly not. Again, whether that's a generalization, I don't know. I haven't met every Christian, but certainly the missionaries who came to my door, who will never come again during Shabbos lunch. But what's it called? That was the chasm. Now, again, the Jake issue. Let's get it clear. Jake issue is once you journey, you come to the wrong discovery. How does that work? Okay, so I'm going to quote to you, and this I will read, a very, I'd say very sharp, which needs discussion in and of itself. We don't have time to give it a full discussion. I think it's a very important piece by someone called Rabbi Elchanan Wasserman. Rabbi Elchanan Wasserman was actually an amazing person. He was the head of a yeshiva in the 1920s, 1930s. He was a student of the Chavetz Chaim. He lived in Europe. He was actually in America when the war broke out. He was fundraising. But he asked to go back to Europe to be with his students. And ultimately, that spelled his demise. He was killed by the Nazis along with all his students in Baranovich, which is where his yeshiva was. Okay, but we still have his writings. Some of it survived. His son survived. And he writes as follows. There's an amazing thing. He says, and I'll quote the English. He says, he says, oh, here we are. Says, when we contemplate the world accurately, yeah, he says, it turns out that emunah, that God created the world, is a simple thing, the translation, for anyone who wishes to analyze the world accurately. He says there's no need for tremendous depth, or we would say PhD in philosophy to see this, is when someone to look at a water wheel. Right, that was kind of the standard technology in his day, right? If you look at a water wheel and say, well, this occurred by itself, there was no one designing it, etc., we would consider them irrational. If you were to spill ink on a canvas, if you go to someone's house and have this beautiful painting, and you say, wow, that painting, probably was ink spilled on it accidentally, etc., right? This is called the watchmaker theory. Our natural reaction would be, well, hold on a second, that's clearly made with an order. But there's clearly an interrelationship here. He says we wouldn't believe someone who just went around claiming that anything that had real, depth of order and of purpose was just random. He says, how can a thinking being, he puts it quite sharply, he says, how can a thinking being say all of creation happened by itself? And he continues, he says, emunah is simple and must be so for anyone who wishes to investigate clearly, on the condition that they want to see things clearly without any bias. Amazing thing. In other words, let me try and explain that. In other words, what Rabbi Elchanan says, and he's going in the Jake people, is that yes, you're supposed to investigate 100%. He says, but we have sound, I don't want to use the word faith. We have sound, they call it belief, right? Confidence that someone who wishes to investigate properly, right, without any notions of bias, etc., will come to this conclusion. Right? So if you've got your Jake models and your Yaakov models, the Yaakov models are proponents of the notion that it doesn't matter how you get there, you get there. Even though it is logical, you don't need to go through that. The Jake proponents say, no, you have to question, 100% question, just but we have a confidence, if you're questioning correctly and with the right notions and constructs, etc., you will get to that answer. Okay? What we still need to do, and we'll continue journeying, please God, through this next week, is firstly, does the journey stop there? Right? In other words, okay, you've got your Yaakov and your Jake points, right? But does the emunah journey stop there? I'll put it slightly differently. If you are a Jake kind of person, so yeah, emunah is in your head, you worked it out, etc. But how does that then deepen, right? How does one deepen that? And just how does one understand the method, so to speak, of deepening that? And we're going to look at two forms of emunah or faith next week: intellectual knowledge and what's called a deep or sensual knowledge. That is point number one. And number two, we will look at hopefully some of those logical and rational arguments which are important in and of themselves. So let me just summarize what we've done today. I think we've done quite a lot. I think we've done quite a lot of groundwork and done things that are important foundationally. Number one, we talked about Yaakov and Jake. Yeah, in other words, is emunah purely rational? Does emunah have to be attacked or got to, so to be journeyed to rationally or not? We looked at how those models worked. We looked at the centrality of faith, or sort of centrality of emunah, and that was the second level. And then we saw a little bit how Yaakov and Jake work. In other words, the way Rabbi Chana Wasserman understands the kind of Jake model is that some question there's the work, I would say, of emunah, of faith, is a work of making oneself unbiased, willing to tackle the issues without any inherent bias, look at the world accurately. And the last thing, which Jonathan, you'll be happy with, which we'll deal with mostly next week, but I want to just throw in a line now, even though we're a couple of minutes late, and I apologize, which is like this. If emunah means knowledge, in other words, we're Jakes and we're expected to work it out, you could ask, what is the word emunah anyway? How do we mistranslate it as faith if it just means knowledge and knowing? You can't command, if the command is to know, then you know, so finished, right? Put differently, when God says to the Jewish people on Mount Sinai, I'm the Lord your God, believe in me, obviously, I'm obviously going to believe in him, he's talking to me, right? So there, Jonathan, as you alluded to before, emunah might not mean belief, might not mean blind faith, but it might mean faithfulness. We have a source in the Torah for that as well. In other words, emunah means having your knowledge and holding it, but actually living through it. Okay, so that, please God, we'll also work out a little bit more next week. That is the menu. And please God, look, everyone should have a wonderful Purim. Again, we're back to faith next week. There's going to be two modes: intellectual knowledge and ingrained knowledge. We'll see how we get there, please God. And then we're going to move on to what's called bitachon, which has now got the knowledge. What about trusting in God? Good. All right. Have an amazing Purim, everyone. Really good to see you all. Please God, same time next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you.
Happy Purim. Thank you.
Purim Sameach.